Hi, my name is Cameron Smith, and today I'm going to be responding to the argument made by my opponent that America would benefit from a full-scale ban on the ownership, sale, and purchase of semi-automatic weapons. And I'll be offering an alternative perspective to that argument. I think it might be a good idea before we begin to discuss some terminology, because there's a lot of confusion and scary sounding words that get thrown around when we discuss firearms. And it's important that we all know exactly what it is that we're talking about when we discuss something as significant as restricting the Second Amendment. Semi-automatic weapons are different from automatic weapons, which is something that those unfamiliar with firearms might not be aware of. And the distinction is important. An automatic weapon is a weapon that continues to fire rounds or bullets as long as the trigger is pulled. These types of weapons are almost exclusively used by military and law enforcement, and their ownership by private civilians is incredibly tightly regulated by the federal government. It's already federally illegal in all cases for a civilian to own a fully automatic weapon manufactured before 1946. A semi-automatic firearm, the type that my opponent is suggesting a ban on, are firearms that fire one round per pull of the trigger. Semi-automatic weapons range from everything from simple handguns that are owned and used across the country to hunting rifles, all the way up to the controversial and somewhat infamous AR-15 that has become so vilified in the media. Semi-automatic weapons are so broad a category that banning them in America would affect almost every firearm in circulation and would be a logistical nightmare to enforce, on top of most likely being ridiculously unpopular with gun owners. My opponent brought up the rate of mass shootings in America as incredibly high and referenced the strict gun laws in European nations like Germany to demonstrate that strict gun laws equate to safer societies. There are a few issues with this comparison, the first being size. The United States is around 28 times larger than Germany, which to put in perspective means that Germany is roughly the size of Montana. There are large areas of the United States that are incredibly rural, and the people living out in these vast expanses of land are far from any sort of emergency services. These people rely on firearms, including semi-automatic firearms, to protect themselves, their families, and their livestock from predators and other threats. Germany also has a population of around 82 million civilians, according to their most recent census data, whereas America has around 325 million citizens, according to our most recent census data. The disparity between the two nations makes it incredibly difficult to compare them, and when debating sensible gun laws, we need to be aware of the fact that we're geographically and population-wise a much larger nation, which makes policing and enforcing any new laws much more difficult. Enacting new firearms laws is also made easier in Germany by the fact that their constitution has no amendment guaranteeing its citizens the right to bear arms, which is something that we obviously do have here in the United States. One of the assertions that my opponent makes, especially when comparing gun violence in the US to gun violence in Germany, is that stricter gun control laws equate to greater safety. The evidence does not conclusively show this to be true, and it certainly could be the case that measures that worked in Germany or other countries might not translate well to a country like America. In fact, when we take a look at communities within the United States that have attempted to limit gun violence by enacting stricter gun control laws, we don't necessarily see the same effect. Gun laws in Illinois are among the strictest in the nation, according to the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, but Chicago had over 4,000 shooting victims in 2016, according to crime statistics collected by the FBI. We can't say for certain that tighter gun control laws will directly result in less gun violence until more data is collected, but we do know that an outright ban on semi-automatic weapons would restrict citizens of cities like Chicago from being able to legally protect themselves. While my opponent made fair points regarding the frequency of gun violence in the United States, I feel like a discussion about gun rights is incomplete without including any examples of their use by law-abiding registered gun owners. In November of 2017, a former National Rifle Association instructor named Stephen Wilford shot and injured the mass shooter who took the lives of 26 Texas churchgoers, causing him to drop his weapon and flee the scene, potentially preventing further deaths. Wilford was armed with a semi-automatic AR-15 style rifle. In April of 2015, an Uber driver in Chicago used his licensed semi-automatic handgun to take down a man who had begun to open fire into a crowd of people in Logan Square in Chicago, again potentially saving an untold number of lives. These are just two extreme examples, and the reality is that responsible gun owners use their weapons in self-defense or in defense of others with more regularity than is often reported. A study funded by the Center for Disease Control found that almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun use by victims are at least as common as offensive use by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million instances. So when my opponent asks what possible use citizens could have for semi-automatic weapons, this is in some cases the answer. While it is undeniable that criminals use guns to commit crimes in some situations, it is inaccurate and unfair to pretend like firearms are inherently evil or only ever used by criminals. The American Journal of Public Health found that around 3 million Americans carry a registered and loaded handgun on them every day, and the vast majority of these people are law-abiding citizens who do so for their own protection and potentially the protection of those around them. When we talk about implementing a nationwide ban on semi-automatic weapons, these people are impacted too, and their ability to protect themselves and others is threatened. I'm not in any way advocating for gun ownership that's completely free of any kind of regulation, and in fact, I entirely agree with my opponent's assessment that something needs to be done in order to make our country safer and reduce rates of gun violence. I also support her suggestion to create stricter background checks to ensure that firearms stay out of the hands of those with severe mental illnesses and others who should not have access to them. I do, however, disagree with her argument that a nationwide ban of semi-automatic weapons is the correct response. In short, I disagree with this position because the language is far too broad and encompasses an incredible amount of weapons currently in circulation, because I'm not convinced that the data supports the idea that stricter gun laws directly correlate to safer cities or societies, and because I think it's important to note that there are instances where gun owners use these types of weapons to prevent harm to themselves or others. The Founding Fathers wrote two very important phrases into our Second Amendment, the first being well-regulated militia, and the second being shall not be infringed. It is our job to figure out how best to balance these two ideas and to advocate for effective gun legislation that also respects the constitutional rights of gun owners. I believe that this balance is best achieved through practical, common-sense firearm legislation, like increased background checks as opposed to broad and sweeping gun bans that affect gun owners who have done nothing wrong and committed no crimes. Thank you.